Chag Sameach, everybody. Good morning. In the fall, I did an online class program with Rabbi Becca Walker. We called it Rabbi versus Rabbi, and in it we each picked two different sides of an argument, a conversation, to show that on most topics there are different Jewish opinions. And in general, we assigned the topics randomly. They didn't necessarily reflect our own views, which side of the issue we were on, which side of the debate. But in one of them, the question of intention or action, which one matters more, intention or action? I got the side of intention, which is actually the side that I stand on. It's not to say that I think that actions and deeds are not important, but I think our intention, the reasoning behind them, plays a larger role. So the question I want to ask you now, and we'll try to do this a little bit participatory. I know it's not the usual way, but it's 3-day Chag, so it's good to wake us up a little bit. But we've had 2 seders now. And at the seder we say Matzah al Shumma. Why do we eat this matzah? Does anyone want to tell me? Why do we eat the matzah? There wasn't enough time for the bread to rise. Great. If you have your Etz Chaim still handy, you're welcome to follow along. That's on page 388. Chapter 12, verse 39 of Exodus. They baked unleavened cakes of dough that they had taken out of Egypt, for it was not leavened since they had been driven out of Egypt and could not delay, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. So it's great, right? I know Rabbi Grover and Chazan Kavari paid attention at their seders. Okay? Expected more hands, guys. But there's a problem with this answer. Because if you go back to page 385 to chapter 12, verse 18, it tells us in the first month, from the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. And then few verses behind that, verse 15, Shivat Yamim Matzah Tochelu. 7 days you will eat matzah. So what's the issue? 2 weeks before they even left Egypt, they were told what was coming. 2 weeks before they found themselves on the run, unprepared, without time to let their dough rise, they were commanded, for 7 days you will eat matzah. So I asked the same question. Matzah al Shumma, why do we eat the matzah? If it's because it did not have time to rise, it doesn't make sense. Why were we commanded beforehand? Is it to remember the rush of which they left? Or is it to fill a commandment of God? And in the end, it's the same act, eating matzah. But I want us to think about the intention behind it. And the question could be, why does that matter? Why do we care what the intention is? For 7 days we eat matzah. Whether it's to remember the rush our ancestors were in, or it's to remember the commandment God gave them 2 weeks prior to leaving. We eat matzah. That's what we do. Why does it matter the reason? So I want us to think of another type of matzah, shmora matzah. It's a special matzah that's been guarded to an extra degree. And it's not the way regular matzah is guarded, because regular matzah is guarded, right? They put a stamp on it that says kosher le-Pesach. It's been watched and preserved for Pesach. So what makes shmora matzah special? It actually has its origins in the Torah, in chapter 12, verse 17. Ushmartem et ha-matzot. You shall guard the matzot. Now many translations, like the one we actually use, the Etz Chaim, it takes it a little less literally. And it understands it as you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, right? Like, you should guard the Sabbath, you should observe the Sabbath, you should observe, they insert the words, the feast of matzot, the festival of matzot. But if we go back to various midrashim, early sources around the time of the Mishnah, it's clear that the rabbis understood it to be a command. Guard the matzah. Don't let it become chametz. And we find this view expressed in the Talmud when one rabbi asks another one, how do we know that the grain offering must be carefully prepared so it won't leaven? And the answer is we learned it from Pesach. Ushmortem et hamatzot. Guard the matzah. Don't let it become chametz. But then we find a different view. Rabbah offers us another stance. The question is, can unleavened bread made for another ritual purpose be used as matzah at the seder? And Rabbah says no. And his reason is, Ushmortem et hamatzot. You shall guard the matzah for the sake of it being matzah. He tells us that it doesn't matter if it's also unleavened, if it meets all the other qualifications of matzah. If it wasn't from the time it was made intended to be matzah, you cannot fulfill the command of eating matzah at your seder with it. And this view grows in the Gemara, and the intention behind the matzah is given a greater and greater role. Some Talmudic sources went as far as saying that the guarding should begin all the way back when the grain is harvested. All the way through the process, there has to be the intention that this will become matzah. So in the end, this idea of shvortem et hamatzot, guarding the matzah, is transformed from a practical issue, don't let it be chometz, to a ritual one, a question of intent, of kavanah, the intention that goes into the act. And that's what I want to think about this morning. Jewish ritual is extremely interested in one's intention. And this goes back to the sacrificial practice of our ancestors. The Kohen, Hazan Kafari's great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, the Kohen had to have a proper intention to offer a sacrifice. They could not offer it if their intention was wrong, even if it was the same action. A person eating the paschal offering has to have the correct intention, or else they were forbidden from eating it. It's codified in later rituals. The shofar, both the person blowing it and the person hearing it have to have the proper intention. What about in prayer, in the Amidah? We all know when we pray we're supposed to stand up, we're supposed to face towards Jerusalem. We shouldn't be moving around, you're supposed to stand still. And yet, it's codified in our rules, in our laws, that if it would prevent you from having the proper intention, it's okay to face the other direction or a different direction. If it would prevent you from davening with the proper intention, it's okay to sit down and remain seated. In the Shulchan Aruch, it goes as far as saying that you could even ride on the back of an animal if stopping would cause you to mess up your focus, your intention on your davening. It would be a distraction. The intention there is what matters. Our tradition emphasizes this. Two pieces of matzah can appear exactly identical. Under any scientific lab we could possibly put them in, any test we could run them through, they'd be indistinguishable. Except one would be okay and the other not, because the intention behind why it was made matters. And yet at the same time, two different people can be praying in different ways. But they both have the same intention, fulfill the same ritual requirement. So going back to that question, matzah al shumah, what is the reason for it? Is it a commandment to remember the rush our ancestors were in? Yes. Is it to fulfill the commandment that God gave them 2 weeks prior? Yes. Both are correct. Regardless of the original reason, both have come to hold normative positions in our tradition, and we should have both intentions in mind. But notice that you still have to have one of these intentions in mind. You have to have a reason in mind when you eat it. Because simply eating matzah without the intention doesn't raise it to the level of a religious act. Ritual derives its meaning not from the act itself, but in the intention behind it, the intention bestowed upon it by the person performing it. Today, the conservative movement is facing tremendous challenges. At one point, it was the largest movement and the fastest growing movement in North America. But those days are gone. And here at Beth Tikvah, I know we're incredibly proud to be a conservative synagogue. Yet I think even here we face the same problem that is throughout the conservative movement. I think that too many conservative Jews today don't know what it means to be a conservative Jew. People today identify denominations based on acts, the action. They have a lot of changes in their prayer. They have a lot of English. So that's Reform. They don't have any changes. They used all the Hebrew. That must be Orthodox. Oh, but they have separate seating for different genders. So that's Orthodox. People understand conservative Judaism to be some middle ground, some vacuous space between Reform and Orthodoxy. It's the space for those who don't fit into either of the other categories, rather than a destination on its own. It's for people who don't see themselves as something else, as opposed to for people who believe in what the movement stands for. But that's not the case. Conservative Judaism is its own destination. It's a philosophy, it's an approach to tradition and to modernity. It's an approach to law and to change. It's about the intention rather than simply the acts. What connects us as conservative Jews isn't a single practice. The Committee of Jewish Law and Standards has multiple accepted opinions on most issues, and all but 3 of them are non-binding. But what unites us is a process, a way of thinking, a desire to live in the present while being rooted deeply in the past. And one of the strengths of our movement at the outset was that not every conservative Jew practiced in the same way. And today that spectrum of practice has gotten even wider. We've always been a big tent, and that was okay. Because we were united in a way of thinking. We were united in a process, in a philosophy, in an intention of what it was we were creating. But today it's become a weakness. The width of our tent, the diversity of practice, which isn't a bad thing on its own, I actually believe quite the opposite. But without a unified practice or a unified intention behind it, the conservative movement's lost its identity. It's become a space for those who don't belong elsewhere, or a space for those who inherited it from a parent, not for those who truly believe in its mission. We've forgotten that intention matters. And that is one of the lessons I think we can learn from Pesach. The seder reminds us that our intentions matter. The matzah must be intended to be matzah. It reminds us of how our ancestors fled Egypt quickly, and it must also be there to fulfill the commandment that God gave them to eat it. And it's only with both of these that the action of eating matzah rises to a religious act. It's these that link us not just with every other Jew celebrating Pesach this year, but with every Jew who ever did. The action alone is not enough. Without intent, the seder is just a meal. Even if you read every word in the Haggadah and perform every act, without intention, it's just a bad dinner party. You might be surprised to know that over the years the seder plate has changed. Today we use beitzah and zeroah, an egg and a shank bone. One symbolizes the Paschal offering, the other the festival sacrifice. But in the Talmud, they actually offer us different foods to put on. One rabbi uses beets and rice as his 2 cooked foods to symbolize those. Another uses fish and egg. Another, my favorite opinion, so you have to have 2 types of meat. You're remembering a sacrifice after all. You should have 2 different cooked meats on your plate. What unites them isn't the act, but the intention. And we're tied to that tradition through the intent today. They may have had different foods on their seder plate, but they had remembered the same thing. A final thought from the seder. It's more than just remembering the past. In the Magid section, we're transported through time. It's anachronistic. We jump between. We're in Egypt. We're in the desert. We're in Bnei Brak. We're in Yerushalayim. We're at seders at different points in history. We're sitting with the rabbis in the Beit Midrash, and we're fleeing Egypt with the Red Sea ahead of us. The Seder is as much about remembering the Exodus as it is about recognizing what Judaism is, the rabbinic process. questions and answers, elevating everyday acts into sacred rituals by imbuing them with meaning, with intent. My hope this Pesach is that we can turn back the tide. We can reinvigorate our own personal ritual practice with intentionality. And we can rebuild our Jewish practice with meaning rather than actions which check a box. And that as a community and as a movement, we can focus less on the specific acts a person does, on how another's Judaism is played out indeed, but rather on the intention. We can begin to not be a place just for those who don't fit in elsewhere, but a place with a mission, a denomination with a purpose, with a goal, with intention. Chag Sameach.